He is a scholar in Asian studies. He's worked with the United Nations in Cambodia, worked with the State Department, the Foreign Relations Committee, and he writes novels about genetics, I guess in his spare time.
Insomnia.
Insomnia, yeah. So this is his book, Genesis Code. It's available in the Brandeis bookstore. And hopefully he'll be so provocative that everybody will go out.
Good.
Right outside.
It's real outside. Wow.
Oh, it's for sale outside. Good. Okay, so without further ado, Jamie,
good.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. I haven't earned anything yet, so hold your applause. But I'm thrilled to be at Brandeis. I think a number of you know at Brandeis there's a center for justice, ethics, and public life, or it's got a lot of those words in some order, and I've had the tremendous privilege to be on the advisory board of that for a number of years, and working with Dan Terrace and Marcy McPhee, who's here somewhere, and other members of the team. So it's really just a great pleasure for me to be back at Brandeis, and obviously terrific to meet Professor Wang, who before meeting him, I thought this is so great that Brandeis, I know that there's 20% of the incoming class is Chinese, and they already have Chinese professors on faculty, but it turns out that wasn't the case. And I'm thrilled to be here with all.
They all know my Y chromosome.
Okay,
story,
good,
so
good. And I'm thrilled to be here with all of you, and I understand that half of you are part of Professor Wang's course, and half of you are people who are interested in the topic but not part of the course. And I've been, since my novel Genesis Code came out in the beginning of November, I've been traveling all around the country and giving talks and book tour events and things like that. But there's something, and every time you go to an event, you just kind of have this moment of insecurity, which is, what if nobody comes? But it's so comforting to have to come to a talk where 40% of the people just have to come. So you already have 50% prisoner audience and 50%. So anyway, so for all of those reasons, I'm really thrilled to be here. But another reason why I'm thrilled to be here is to talk about what I see as probably the greatest transformation of all of our lifetimes, and that is the genetics revolution in my view. And I'll start with a caveat. I am not a scientist, and I think of myself as a person who thinks deeply about what are the future implications of current technologies. But Professor Wang is a scientist. Many of you are budding scientists, so feel free to disagree with anything that I say on a scientific level or on any other level. And Professor Wang and I have been debating some of these topics over the last hour and a half. But 2 weeks ago, something happened. And something happened that I believe that 100 years from now, when people are looking back at this time, they're going to say, wow, that was a really, really big deal. And when you think about, well, what was dominating the news 2 weeks ago, a lot of it was ISIS. And 100 years from now, my guess is people won't remember ISIS, so they won't remember the name. It won't mean much. There are a lot of stories that are out there that people are not going to remember. But the story that I believe will be a fundamental transformation over time of our species was hardly covered in the newspapers. And what that was is the British House of Lords passed a bill which had already been passed by the British House of Commons. And some of you who are in this class maybe know about this. But what the bill did was authorize clinical trials in the United Kingdom of a process called mitochondrial transfer. And for those of you who don't know, mitochondrial transfer is a process, if you think of an egg or an early stage embryo as having, we'll use the chicken egg model. The egg yolk is the nucleus and the white is the protoplasm. And in the protoplasm, there are these things called mitochondria. And mitochondria are the power packs of the cell. And so for some women who have mitochondrial disease, there's a chance that they'll pass it on, or they will pass it on to their children at various levels, and so there are various levels of disease. And so there's a procedure that has been pioneered both in the United States and the United Kingdom of mitochondrial transfer. And so going back to the chicken egg thing, you have the yolk of one. You can do it with either an egg or a blastocyst, an early stage embryo. So we'll just start with egg. You have the yolk of the genetic mother, because 99.9% of DNA is passed through the nucleus. And you have the egg white, or the protoplasm, of the donor. And you can do that either with an egg or with an early stage embryo. And so there was a big debate about whether this should be authorized or should not be authorized. And I had an editorial in the Washington Post about this. Many people weighed in, and I certainly was one who was supportive of the bill that was ultimately passed by the British Parliament. And there were some people, many people actually, who were part of the supportive camp, and they were trying to, because the opponents were saying that if this is passed, it's a slippery slope towards genetic engineering and designer babies. The people who were supporting this bill said this is really, it's not a big deal. Because anybody who's getting an organ transplant or a blood transfusion, they get more foreign DNA than a woman or parents who are using mitochondrial transfer. Although I'm supportive, I see it a little bit differently. So now this bill has passed, and we're going to begin very shortly clinical trials in the United Kingdom. And that means that whenever it begins, let's say 3 months from now or 5 months from now, plus 9 months, we are going to have the world's first state-authorized genetically enhanced human beings, which is a really, really, really big deal from an evolutionary perspective. And it's probably going to work. And we were just talking, I can't remember the name of with Ken Pierce, who specializes in this. So I think most people and most scientists think that it's going to work, so that the mitochondrial disease is a disease that mothers have that pass on to their children, because, as I mentioned before, mitochondria are the power packs of the cell. The children who have faulty mitochondria, they aren't ultimately able to power things, parts of the human that take a lot of energy, and obviously the brain takes the most energy of all of our organs. And so we're going to be able to either, through this process, either eliminate or significantly reduce mitochondrial disease. And this is a relatively small number of people who this will benefit, but for them, it's actually very, very important. And so for the people who say it's not a big deal, you say, well, I think they did the numbers. It was like 2,000 people could benefit from this per year in the United Kingdom, and maybe 9,000 in the United States per year, which again, in the grand scheme of things, is relatively small. But that's, hi there, my goddaughter. But that's step one. The reason why I am both supportive and I think this is a big deal, because right now, so we've already, at least starting in the United Kingdom, and right now mitochondrial transfer is being considered as a regulatory matter under the US Food and Drug Administration. It'll probably take a couple of years. But I think it's going to be very difficult for the FDA to say no, because we're going to have a procedure that can eliminate this genetic disease, this terrible genetic disease, for parents who are carriers of it. And so, but then what happens? So now we have other ways of screening for other genetic diseases, which we haven't yet, which we've only begun to do. So who here, and I imagine it's everybody in the room, knows what IVF is? Yeah, everybody? In vitro fertilization. Who here knows what PGD is? Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. All right, so fewer. So IVF, you know, is the woman has the eggs extracted. And then the man has the sperm, quote unquote, extracted, although it's much easier. And and so in IVF, the eggs are fertilized outside of the body, and then they're re-implanted in the mother. And what PGD is so you all know from high school biology that all of you started as one cell, then you became 2 cells, then you became 4 cells, and at roughly 5 days, we were all 8 cells. And in PGD, you take away 2 of those cells, and then you can test them. And what can you test them for? Well, you all know about the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project took about 10 years and cost about $3 billion, and allows us to sequence these genomes. And so when you're doing PGD, you extract 1 cell, and let's just say the average woman who's having her eggs extracted gets 15 eggs. And sometimes it's more, and sometimes it's less. But let's call it 10, just for the sake of this conversation. So you have your 10 eggs, you fertilize them with sperm, and now you have 10 blastocysts, 10 kind of early stage embryos, fertilized eggs. And you would take those 2 cells from each one of those, and then you test them. You do a full genome sequencing on each of those cells extracted from each of those 10 blastocysts. And then what you know from reading those is just anything you know from reading the genome. And so right now, we're not very sophisticated in our ability to read the genome, but we can tell a lot of things. We can tell the gender, and we can tell there are a lot of single gene mutations, like things like Tay-Sachs and cystic fibrosis, and there are a lot of different things, or chromosomal diseases like Down syndrome. And we can know those right now. And so right now, today, in states where it's legal, and this is one, you can have, using PGD, you can screen these early stage embryos, and then you can make a decision, again, where it's legal. Do I want to have a boy or a girl? If you're trying to balance the gender of your children. If you're a carrier for Tay-Sachs, you can screen and say, well, I don't want to implant an embryo that is a carrier for Tay-Sachs. So we can select out certain things that we don't want, based on our understanding of what the genome says. But so I talked about how the Human Genome Project, it took the first one, took 10 years and costs $3 billion. And now it can be done in a few hours and costs $1,000. And you all know about Moore's law, which is basically the speed of computing doubles every 18 months. And that's going to continue for a very long time. And the cost, when you look at the decrease in cost of going from $3 billion to $1,000, you can safely assume that in a very short order, 5 or 10 years, we're going to be able to do a full genome sequencing in, pick a number, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and pick a cost. Maybe it's $1, maybe it's $5, maybe it's $10, but it's not $100. So basically, genome sequencing is going to be essentially free. And now imagine that you have each of these 10 blastocysts, and as genome sequencing becomes free, and because of personalized medicine, everybody is going to have their genome sequenced and on file, because right now we have generalized medicine, which is if you're not feeling well, you take an aspirin, or you take a Tylenol. But there's a certain percentage of the population, if you take a Tylenol, you get incredibly sick. And that's true for chemotherapy. It's true for a lot of things that we do in this generalized medicine model. And when we talk about that we have today, when we talk about personalized medicine, what it means is you're going to have your genome, and people are going to think about how does this one treatment affect you? And you're going to be able to test things. And so everybody is going to have, as an essential part of your medical file, your full genome sequenced. And then people are going to be able to compare your life experience and like how tall you are, what your IQ is, what diseases you got at what age, and all of these things, what color your eyes are. You're going to be able to compare that based on your genome. And when it's millions, hundreds of millions, maybe someday billions of people who all have their genomes sequenced, we're going to be able to do what's called genome-wide association studies. And what that is going to enable is, right now where we can say there's one gene on or off, we're going to be able to talk about traits. Height, people think that about 1,000 genes determine how tall you are. But if you have 1 million, 10 million, 100 million people, and all of those people have had their genome studied, and we do the big data analysis, we're going to know, I believe, within a couple of years, from that 5-day-old embryo, within an inch or two, how tall that person is going to be, provided that they get adequate nutrition and are nurtured and all of those other things. And according to a person who I know who's probably the top specialist on this in the country, he believes that within 10 years, we're going to be able to take that single cell from a 5-day-old embryo, and again, assuming proper nutrition and everything else, we're going to be able to predict within maybe 5 or 10 points what the IQ of that person will be. And think about this. So now you have these 10 embryos, and the eggs are extracted, the eggs are inseminated, now they're blastocysts, and now you do the genomic analysis, and the first thing is you'll be able to screen out all of these genetic diseases. And you're going to be able to figure out how tall each one of those is going to be, maybe what the IQ of each one of those of your potential children will be. And then you're going to be asked to make a choice in jurisdictions where it's legal. And you're going to say, well, of these 10, which ones do I want to implant? And you'll be able to say, well, this one's going to be this tall, and this one's going to be this smart, and you assume that everything else is being equal, nutrition, and maybe that's not always the case. But people will have at least the potential to make that choice if that choice is legal in the jurisdiction where they are. And the very same technology that is going to allow us to screen out the genetic disease will give us the information about all of these other quote-unquote positive traits, like height, like intelligence, and many other things. And there are debates among people about what percentage of our being is based on our genetics. But nobody says that it's 100, but it's certainly not 10. You just look around this room. I mean, I think a lot of what we are is baked into us, not everything. And so when this starts happening, it's going to be very destabilizing for a lot of places, because these technologies, these processes that I'm talking about, it's not like this is some science fiction future. We don't need any new technologies to do everything that I've described. We need continued evolution of technologies that already exist, and we don't even need that evolution to happen as quickly as it's already happened. So this is our future. And then when you think about what's happening now in research, again, that already exists with stem cells, right now, when I mentioned when a woman has her eggs extracted, it's on average 15 eggs are extracted, which is a limitation, human mammal egg production. In the average male ejaculation, there are hundreds of millions of sperm cells. But what if you could increase the number of eggs? And that's something that we have the technology to do today, and we're doing it in mice. It hasn't been done in humans. But what you need to do is just take a stem cell, and it can either be an embryonic stem cell or an induced pluripotent stem cell. And there are some issues that Professor Wang and I were talking about earlier about induced pluripotent stem cells. But basically what an iPS cell is you can take a skin graft, and you turn that, you revert that into a stem cell. Or you just start with the stem cell and you go skin cell into a stem cell into an egg cell into an egg. Or you just start with the stem cell, so it's stem cell, egg. And now, instead of having, let's say, 10 or 15 eggs, you have as many as you can afford. So let's call that 100. It could be 1,000, it could be 10,000, whatever it is. So let's just say you have your 100 eggs, and then now you inseminate all of those eggs, you fertilize all of those eggs, and now you have your 100 blastocysts, and you do the full genomic reading of each one of those, and you get a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet doesn't say that your kid is going to have a yellow shirt and wear blue Old Navy pants. What it says is that of these 100 possible kids that you might have, these 50 are very likely or almost certain to have Down syndrome, and these 25 have markers that have in many cases been associated with genius, and these 15 have genes that every person who's ever won the 100 meters in the Olympics has, and nothing will be, most of it will not, some will be certain, a lot of it will be probabilities based on these genome-wide association studies. And then people who choose to do so in jurisdictions where it's legal will be able to pick, essentially, which children and all of their potential quote-unquote natural children they'd like to have implanted. And there's a lot of this that people are very troubled with. And because we have just baked into our experience as human beings, there's a sense of quote-unquote nature, or of people because they have a certain grit, they climb out of nowhere and they do tremendous things. And that still will exist, but we're going to think more and more about our children as we're going to think more of making rational choices based on predictions and based on genetic readings of our children. And the other thing is that will push us towards doing IVF more and more and more is we talked about the different types of stem cells. There's the iPS cells, and Professor Wang has done studies on this and others, that if you take an adult stem cell and you revert it to a stem cell, it's not as good as the most perfect stem cell. And the most perfect stem cell is you at 1 cell old. When you're 1 cell old, you are the perfect archetypal stem cell. And so now when we think about using IVF and PGD, we're going to be able we are today able to take those cells away, those 2 cells at 8 cells. But if we culture those cells, then everybody will be able to have basically a cloned ball of cells of yourself. It's like a little mini clone of you. And I believe that many, many people will want to have that cloned ball of cells, which I'm sure some people with different persuasions will call that a little person, but a cloned ball of cells, because in the future, if you are having a problem with your liver or your lung or whatever, or your kidney, you're going to be able to take those stem cells and you're going to use the stem cell, the embryonic stem cell, to grow liver cells to 3D print a liver or a kidney. And in personalized medicine, these stem cells are going to be, I believe, an essential part of how healthcare is delivered. And because of this, I believe, and Professor Wang disagrees on this, but I believe that over time, human beings, advantaged human beings, and what's defined as advantage will democratize over time, will use sex less and less as a means of procreation. People will still have sex for all the other reasons why people do it, but in terms of for procreation, I believe that for advantaged people, having children through sex will become the equivalent of people not immunizing their children, or how we think of Christian Scientists. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's an ideological decision that for the mainstream puts children unnecessarily at risk. Because the people who have children in the quote-unquote natural way, the way that most people do it today, they're not going to be able to store those stem cells. They're not going to be able to screen out genetic diseases. And they're not going to be able to, over time, to make these kinds of decisions about the optimization of their potential children. And for all of the people who are saying, wow, this is terrifying, I don't want to do that, that will be a perfectly legitimate choice. And some jurisdictions, and maybe even the United States, will say, this is terrible, this is not what it means to be a human being, and that will be a completely valid decision. But that doesn't mean that every jurisdiction will do that. As a matter of fact, it's extremely unlikely, in my view, that every jurisdiction will do that. And we can just look to the George W. Bush administration, where there was all of this concern about stem cell research. And so the US blocked funding for certain kinds of stem cell research. A lot of our best researchers left the United States and went to Singapore, went to England. It was bad for the United States. It didn't slow the advance of stem cell research in any way. So let's just say that the United States blocks the advance in this technology. But other jurisdictions, let's say China or Korea or somebody else, decides to go forward. Then what are we going to do about it? Are we going to make it illegal for somebody from the United States to procreate with somebody from one of those countries? Are we going to do genetic tests at our borders to keep people from there coming in? So you can imagine how very, very quickly this process can lead to international instability. And you can imagine how there will be a lot of pressures both within societies and between societies to do this. Because if you are in a generation where it's a choice, and there'll be many stages of transition, within a society, if you're not selecting your potential child with optimal intelligence, or you're not selecting out a child who has some devastating disease like Huntington's or whatever, that will be a choice. But people will look around and will say, oh, you see that person, their child died at 15 from whatever, because they made that choice to have a quote-unquote natural child. And how many times will people have to see that before they start to think, well, that's an unacceptable risk? I mean, right now, people wouldn't think of riding their bicycle without a helmet. But the level of risk of actually getting in a bike crash is relatively small. So I just think that once people have the choice of screening out every genetic disease, and they see people who didn't do it and their children have the genetic disease, or their children aren't able to compete with somebody else whose IQ was optimized through genetic selection, or at a next stage enhanced through genetic manipulation, which is a bit further off, is going to create a lot of pressures within societies. And between societies, there will be some, if the United States, let's say, opts out, and let's just say that China opts in or continues to opt in. Well, what might that look like? And I do a lot of work on China. And one thing that you can say about certainly today's Chinese government is that they are very comfortable with engineering, very comfortable with population engineering through the one-child policy, with environmental engineering through Three Gorges Dam and the south to north water diversion project, and very comfortable with thinking about children as tools for the glory of the state through their Olympic sports schools, where young kids are taken away from their families and they're trained in these schools. And so I started to think about, well, what would it mean X years into the future? And in my book, it's 10 years in the future. If the United States learned that China had a secret genetic enhancement program where they were doing exactly this. They were using the kind of technologies that I've just mentioned, and like their Olympic sports schools, they were taking these super enhanced kids and putting them not in the Olympic sports schools, but in specialty schools for science and math and engineering and business and other things. And what if the United States Intelligence Service learned about this, and the United States had to have in this dialogue internally in the government? Well, what are we going to do about it? If 30 years from now, China, and you could pick any country, it could be Korea, it could be Canada, it doesn't really matter, but in my book it's China. If 30 years from now, China has bred these super enhanced people and are training them in these super specialized schools, are we going to be able to compete? And I think that these kinds of questions, I mean, in some ways they're kind of far off and science fiction-y, but in other ways they are very, very present. And those are the kinds of issues that I tried to address both in the book and in a lot of policy work that I'm doing with Washington, because the fundamental problem that we have, as I see it, is that the science is advancing exponentially. There's nothing that I've mentioned at all today that can't be done with future generations of technologies that already exist. I mean, the embryo selection, the gene editing through CRISPR and other technologies, I mean, all of these things already exist. It's not like we need for some kind of super new technology to be invented. We have all of the technologies. It just needs to evolve further, and it will continue to evolve further. So the science is advancing exponentially, and by exponentially, you all know this, it's a J-curve. And what that means is when we think of a rate of change, we think of what's a 10-year unit of change. So we think just in our heads, intuitively, a 10-year rate of change is kind of the amount of change that happened between 2005 and 2015. But in a J-curve, in an exponential change, it may be that between 2015 and 2025 is 3 times that unit. And so when we think of the rate of change, we are inherently, it's the way our brains tend to work, we are inherently conservative. And so the challenge, as I see it, is the science is advancing exponentially, and our imaginations are only advancing linearly just because we're humans and we have a lot of things on our mind. And the policy and regulatory framework is only inching forward glacially. So there's this monumental mismatch between what's possible, how we're thinking about what's possible, and what we're doing. And I certainly am one. There are some people, there's a movement called the transhumanists, people who believe that there shouldn't be any regulation, that we're moving towards the title of this talk, Homo sapiens 2.0, because 1.0 is flawed. And I certainly, for those people who believe in intelligent design, I just ask, why are there so many damn parts in the human being? It really makes me crazy. Like 9,000 or 9 million could be great, and you have one little thing that doesn't work and you feel like crap. That's not very intelligent. So we're moving towards this new world, and we're not prepared, and it's happening so quickly that we're not, it's almost too big for us to fathom, and that's why we're missing it. And so for me, I had written a bunch of articles on this. I testified before Congress on this. But then I felt like, well, I just didn't feel like I was getting the story out. And that was when I decided to write this novel, Genesis Code. And part of it is about the science, but I feel like ultimately one of the reasons why I think when I give these kinds of talks, it touches people, that this isn't just about science. This is about what it means to be a human being. And in the book, the question is, what does it mean when genetically modified people start showing up among us? It's not just what does it mean from a scientific perspective or even from a national perspective, but from a personal perspective. I mean, when we think about who we are, what is it that makes us human beings? And it's almost a theological question. And whenever I'm talking, I always get this question about the soul, and where does the soul fit in? And for me, it's something that I struggle with, and it's one of the reasons why I've written Genesis Code as a love story, because there's all the science, but at the end of the day, we're human. And the thing, yes, our genetics make us human, but our emotions, our love, our passions, those are really the things that make us human. But there's a theological question, which is, are humans infinitely complex? And if I were a religious person, or if I believed in the soul, I would say that humans are infinitely complex. And no matter how sophisticated our knowledge is, no matter how smart our machines are, like you'll never be able to capture the essence of a human being. And there are some people like me who believe that humans are only very massively complex, or make it very to the X degree massively complex. But given the rate of increase in the power of our technology, I believe that there will come a time where we will have computers that are more sophisticated than our brains. And the way I think about this is that there's a roundworm, a type of roundworm, C. elegans. It's just a very, very simple hermaphroditic little tiny worm that is used in a lot of scientific research because it's so simple. It has a relatively small number of genes, a relatively small number of neurons. And we've been working on scientists have been working, not me, for 40 years, and now we've mapped each individual neuron. There's a thing called open worm where we kind of have almost a digital version of a roundworm. And I think we're getting close to understanding what a roundworm is and how it ticks. And roundworms, of course, are our relatives. We haven't kind of been close for many billions of years. But if you can understand a roundworm, if you can understand a single-cell organism, logically, you should be able to over time, understand a complicated organism like us. But all of this stuff, it all comes back to the core of what it means to be a human being. And so that's why I think this class is so important. This conversation is so important. And I hope this is please read the book if you'd like, but even if you don't, I hope this is a conversation that you all will have among yourselves, because we are at this stage. It's after, however you count, it's there are 250,000 years of our evolution as a species, or 4.5, whatever the number is, billion years of our evolution from single-cell organisms. We are finally at this place where we can take active control of our evolutionary process. And we're just at the beginning. We've already begun to walk through this door, but we're going to keep going, and that's the nature of our species. I mean, it's hard. I was trying to think if there's one technology which had the promise, that was a good bubble, if one technology that had the promise to really help us, and also the danger of really hurting us, and I think of nuclear technology. And was there ever a chance that we weren't going to exploit nuclear technology for energy, even though the first experience that people had of nuclear technology was Hiroshima and then Nagasaki? And so we are already moving into our genetic future. Our genetic future has already begun. But the question will be, will we do it responsibly, or will we do it irresponsibly? And I don't know the answer to that, but certainly the first step is having the conversation, getting the issues out, and talking among ourselves, so that we can try to grapple with this issue, because this will be, I believe, the greatest challenge of our generation, and ultimately the greatest challenge of our species. It has the potential to do a lot of good, but also the potential to do a lot of harm. So with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
I warned you, he's controversial.
Yeah. And hi, Dan. Hey, do you guys want to come sit down? Yeah.
So for the paper that we wrote for the paper,
Right.
I read partially on this, obviously. I
Okay.
don't know as much. But one of the options when talking about engineering like this,
Yeah.
it was possible that, or the author thought that we might become obsolete if there was like technology that
Mhm.
understood us, like you said. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a huge debate. Years ago, maybe 20 years ago, Bill Joy had an article that was the cover story of Wired. And now there's a book that just came out called Superintelligence. This is talking about this of machine learning. And I think that we could become obsolete, but the good news is that we are the engineers. And so, we could create machines that are our enemies. I mean, we've all, maybe this is aging everybody, but like the Terminator, and I think those are all real possibilities. But I think that's a very long way off. I mean, I think that everybody knows that there are machines that can win at Jeopardy, and now they can win at Atari, and they can win at chess, but generalized intelligence and emotional intelligence and all the myriad forms of intelligence that we have as humans is incredibly complex, and it will be very, very difficult for machines to acquire that. But over time they will. I mean, just if you believe, as I do, that humans are only a very, 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 very complex system, but ultimately, our brain capacity as humans is standard. I mean, it's basically what it is. It's been this way for at least tens of thousands of years. But machine learning is like this, and so if you have one line that's straight and one line that's going up, eventually, if this line keeps going up, it's going to advance beyond this. But still, those machines, if we program them right, will be serving humans. But if we program them wrong, you could imagine all kinds of problems. So I think it's a real danger, but just our very mindfulness of that danger is our protection. Yeah.
Thank you for the compelling talk.
Sure.
I have a question about what this really means on a social justice front.
Yeah.
So you talked about the relationship between like the U.S. and China and
Yeah.
competition, for example. But what does this mean in terms of countries that have less influence and less capital and aren't necessarily
Yeah.
able to compete? And also beyond that, what does it mean within the United States, where there's such a large income disparity that a huge part of the population wouldn't even be able to access resources like this? I know that you did mention that it would be a low-cost operation in time, but we do have the technology to provide health care, for example, for the population at this point, but because of competition, the whole population doesn't receive health care. So, what does this mean?
I think that's really a critically important and essential question, because especially in the early phases, if this all works, and I believe it will, but there are different views, that certainly the people at BGI Shenzhen, which is the leading Chinese genomics company, they have a thing called the Cognitive Genomics Initiative. They believe they can increase IQ by 20 points per generation. So that every time, let's say I talked about those 10 blastocysts, let's say there's a 20 or 30 point IQ variation between the lowest IQ of your potential children and the highest IQ of your potential children. If you continue choosing the highest IQ of your options, that's going to increase your IQ. There's a thing called iterative embryo selection, where you basically do the same thing, but instead of growing each embryo to term, your embryo, you select your highest IQ embryo, and then at 6 months, you have that embryo and another embryo have another child, and you can kind of keep doing that. So there are theories, at least, about how you can jumpstart IQ to getting towards the high point of human capacity. And it's a real question. Within societies, you could imagine that governments and insurance companies eventually will have a huge incentive to make sure people do embryo selection, because the cost of selecting out genetic diseases, which will be lower and lower, will be less than the cost of treating, across the population, people who have a lifetime of those genetic diseases. But there will be huge issues of disparity, and some societies may decide to regulate against that, even to ban this altogether. And they will exist within societies and between societies. But I think the issues of social justice, however people manipulate their genetics, the difference between somebody sitting in this room and your life opportunities and somebody in the Central African Republic and their life opportunities, it doesn't, I mean, separate from genetics, we're already living with this enormous disparity, and this has the potential, it could make it even worse, and I think that's a real danger and an essential point. Yeah?
Glad you brought up the intergenerational increases of IQs. You said that a human capacity is a stagnant line while the growth of machine and the complexity is exponential. But if we are able to modify our genes and produce a more advantageous generation, then I don't see a reason why we won't start being able to increase the percentage of the brain capacity that we use. So if like the average human, I don't know what they normally say, 10%, 11%, but Einstein would use like 1 more percent, 2%. Let's say we use 20%, you know?
Yeah.
Is that a discussion of how dangerous that is for the health of a human being to use, let's say, more than 13%, 14% of his brain? B, can people become too smart that it's actually a danger? Because like,
that's what my girlfriend tells me.
It is for us unimaginable how much potential a human being will have if he uses 20% of his brain.
Yeah, but you know, I'm not a brain scientist by any means, but I have been told, to use a term of art, that thing that everybody says that we only use 10% of our brain. And I think there was the movie with Scarlett Johansson about that. I was told that whole thing is a bubamisa. I don't know what that means. I think it's Latin. That the other 90% of our brains are like doing important things. That if you took 10% more of your brain for figuring out math problems, like you wouldn't be doing something else. But from what I've read, and I certainly wouldn't present myself as an expert, there are physiological limits to IQ, so I don't know whether we could have people who were like 600 or 1,000 or whatever, but I think that over time there's a thing called telekinetics. There are ideas that our natural brains and machines could come together in some ways, and who knows what's possible, but right now we know that the smartest people, like the level of the smartest people, even if measured by IQ, it's not like we're going up, that every year the smartest person in the world is 10 IQ points smarter than the person who last year was the smartest person in the world. But we know that that's happening with computers. So it's an unfulfilling question. Answer to your question. But right now, I think there are physiological limits to our brain, but who knows?
You mentioned the telekinetics. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I think of the idea of connecting your brain to machines. And I actually think we're getting closer and closer to the idea of actually augmenting ourselves with machines. So implanting memory chips so that we can access memory better. Yeah. That could be a way to increase.
Yes, but we're a long line. I recommend this book, Superintelligence, because I thought that too, and then I started reading this book of a guy who really knows what he's talking about, going through like all the steps that it would take, and that everybody's brain is different, and so how would you have some kind of standard technological interface that could capture everybody's brain. So I think it will be more and more true over time. And the way I say it is like I and my iPhone together are smarter than Stephen Hawking without his iPhone. And is the iPhone part of me, or it's kind of part of me? I mean, I'm never without it. If I want to know something, and so I just feel like that technology is part of me. And that just like we look at these old photographs and you say like, oh my God, look at Jenny Huntington's hair or whatever, and now we're going to have this thing. Remember, like you have a photo. Remember, you see that little rectangular thing, and then people are going to laugh. That's when people carried around technology and you put it in your pocket. And so I think the intimacy with which we interact with technology is just going to increase. In my sequel to Genesis Code, which we just submitted to publishers 2 weeks ago, all you have for your technology is you have like a tiny little thing in your ear, you have a bracelet, and you have a contact lens. And basically all the information that you need, it comes through those things. And so I think that technology is going to become more and more a part of us. Yeah.
I just had a question on your use of IQ as a measure of intelligence, because I know recently, like the actual use of IQ as an indicator of your intelligence has been called into question.
Correct.
Because, like you said, humans have different kinds of intelligence, like emotional intelligence for one. and some people are good at math, or others are
Right.
in reading.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, if you were to sequence that code or for the genome, how would you kind of like measure intelligence like objectively? I don't think
Right.
there's necessarily a way that you
Yeah, I think that's an essential question. And the thing is, when we make selections, we will make selections based on our biases. What do we value? What do we think of as intelligence? And there's a real danger if too many people do this and everybody is chasing the same ideal. 200 years ago in Europe, if someone's saying, well, you need to select for traits. Well, what do these people need to do? Well, they need to hunt, and they need big muscles, and they need to be able to shoot things. And then society changed, and those were, like perfectly good to have, but not all that important. And so there's a real danger that if this goes extremely broad, that we'll make all kinds of selections based on biases that we don't even realize that we have. And human diversity, like all diversity of all species, is our greatest protection, because we don't know how the world is going to change, and people who are really well situated for one situation end up being very poorly situated for another. So I think it's I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that's why we need to be as thoughtful and as mindful going forward, and that's why we need to be having these kinds of conversations. Yes, sir.
This is fascinating. You're talking these thoughts. I just want to add a little aspect to that, especially for the students.
Yeah.
And that is that IQ is supposedly one of many measures of potential. Most of us don't live remotely up to our potential for 50 zillion different reasons.
Yeah.
You're already, I hope, as young people, aware of that.
Yeah. Don't
Bach
eat crap.
has never been Bach is a long time ago.
Yeah.
Thomas Edison has never been exceeded, and he's more than 100 years ago. It's not how much IQ you have, it's what you do with it.
Yeah. Well, I would say
That's more, there's no computer to deal with right now,
Yeah.
or anything, but it's
Yeah.
a good thing to be reminded of in a discussion like
Yeah.
this. You don't just sit back and think, if I could
Yeah.
have those 10 points, I could do it all.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really essential point. But unfortunately, I believe that it's both your IQ and what to do with it. If you leave what to do with, like your level of how much you do with what you have constant, and you have to choose, do you want to have 20-point higher or 20-point lower IQ? I think many people would say, well, I'd rather have the me with 20 more IQ points. So I think that if you trade out your 10 or 20 IQ points for the equivalent percentage of complacency in life, then you're nowhere. But in this globally competitive world, whether on the national, societal, or national or international level, we all live in this competitive context. And so I think there's going to be a lot of for the most competitive parents, there's going to be a lot of pressure to give their kids the best chance they can in life. And I believe that embryo selection, sooner rather than later, will be part of that. Dan?
Tell us a little about the policy side, Jamie. You mentioned
Sure.
it's glacial right now. You mentioned you're going down and talking to people. I know there have been lots of smart people who have been on presidential commissions on bioethics and so forth.
Yeah.
Are the ideas out there about what we should do?
The ideas are out there a little bit. I mean, my story of how I got involved in this is in the second Clinton administration. I was working on the National Security Council, and my boss then was a guy named Richard Clark. And Dick used to always say that if everybody in Washington is focusing on one thing, you can be sure there's something else that's 10 times more important that they're not paying attention to. And for him at that time, and this was before 9/11, his big things were terrorism and this crazy guy, Osama bin Laden, and cybercrime. And he was like going crazy and nobody paid attention. And everyone, the word was, this guy's insane, he's going to get us all killed. And then 9/11 happened, and then he was the big hero. And I really took that to heart. And so I was thinking about, well, what are these big issues that we're not paying attention to? And the more I read and studied, the more I just became obsessed with the issues that I talked about today. So I started writing articles about it, and this kind of crazy congressman from Los Angeles called me up and he said, I've read your articles, and this is really important, no one's talking about it. Will you come to Washington and do a hearing? We want to do a hearing based on your article. So I did, and that was what kind of got me involved. But it's so frustrating in that I'm still, and that was in 2008, now it's 7 years later, I'm still in touch with this same congressional office, and I'm hoping that we're going to get this done, and I'm still pushing to just have a congressionally mandated task force on the national security and societal implications of the genetics revolution. But just getting that, and I think we're probably going to get it authorized in the next month or so, is such a huge, monumental undertaking. And when I look at what happened in the United Kingdom, where they were having this debate on mitochondrial transfer, and they had 3 years of public dialogue and public forums around the country and scientific panels, and they really did it the right way. And then they had a national debate and a national dialogue. For us, with this issue of mitochondrial transfer, we're viewing it as a regulatory issue within the FDA. And so we're not having the kind of societal conversation that we need to have, and I think that's the problem. And on one hand, there's a danger of over-regulation, and that was what happened in the George W. Bush administration curtailing stem cell research. But there's another problem. It's not just that we want the free market to apply here, because who knows what people will want. And I think that we as a country and as a species, I think we should have restrictions. It's not that anybody who can do anything. I mean, we have all the technology to create chimeric people who are part animal and part human, and we can do it now. But do we want to do that? And I think those are the conversations. So my view is that we're really nowhere.
So at the risk of being a poor host, I thought I would share with you
Yeah, this is the rebuttal. Yeah.
three areas which one might want to rebut.
Sure.
The first is that, and I agree with him, these are challenging ethical.
Larry, can you stand up so we can hear you in the back?
These are challenging ethical issues, certainly hotly debated and need to be hotly debated. But the question is whether his vision of the future, that these are going to be the determinative issues of our species, is more a question.
Yes,
to me.
absolutely.
So there are 3 areas that I would say are debatable. The first is everything that he's saying so easy to do? It's not so easy to do by any means. So take some comfort. I think it ain't around the corner. Some of these things are certainly years away and millions of dollars away, plus lots of congressional committees away. They're not so easy to do. The second point of contention would be that Jamie has conveniently excluded the nurture part of our beings. And even that component, which is epigenetic and environmentally imposed and so forth. And I think he can be forgiven because he hasn't had children yet. But I'm sure that all of you who have just completed childhood or who have had children know that you don't exactly do what your parents expected you to do, and your kids don't exactly do what they expect you to do, so that the nurture part of nature is a very big component, and there's likely to be a lot of confusion around the kind of genetics that you're talking about by virtue of the epigenetics that actually is part of life. The third potential argument is, quite honestly, that the future of humankind is going to be so entirely overwhelmed by other issues which have major economic implications, major survival implications, that these kinds of luxuries of high-tech worlds that you're talking about will quickly go by the boards. And we exist, I would say, at a pivotal moment, maybe not just in the technologies that you're talking about, but in the very environmental situation that we find ourselves. Global warming and climate change, sea level rise, desertification, those massive global issues will so utterly alter the future of humankind and virtually every other species on Earth that these debates will vanish. Truly they will vanish, because we will be struggling as a species to maintain homeostasis and equilibrium, be it in food healthcare, or water supplies. And quite honestly, the future that you're talking about will never, ever come into being. So,
A quick agreement and rebuttal to the rebuttal. Definitely, the stuff that I'm talking about is scientifically complex, but I talked about exponential growth. And as I said before, we don't need any revolutions to make this happen. We have all of these technologies in early stages now. And again, we can have a slower rate of advance than we've already had. And if it's 10 years or 20 years, let's say it's 30 years, that doesn't mean anything in terms of the evolutionary flow of our species. Nurture, and it comes back to your question, is critically important. And we are part nature and we are part nurture. And I think a lot of people will want the best nature and the best nurture. And if you have more problematic genetic inheritance and you have a more nurturing environment, that'll get you one place. And if you have a less nurturing environment, but you come with a great genetic foundation, that'll get you someplace. But I think that many people will come to believe that having both will give children the best advantage in life. And let's just say that because of climate change, this planet is going to become unlivable. And then, so let's use an example from the plant world. So in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam and Cambodia, they've had a big problem because of climate change. There is a lot of, first there's drought and there's flooding, and then because of the Chinese damming of the upriver of the Mekong, the flow of the Mekong is weakening. And so salt water is coming into the Mekong Delta. And so they have this place where they've grown certain strains of rice for thousands of years that have kept millions of people alive. And now the conditions are changing because of Chinese damming and global warming. And so what are we doing? As a species, we have a thing called the International Rice Research Institute, and we're using genetic modification techniques to create super strains of rice that are drought and flood resistant and that are salt resistant. And let's just say that climate change makes our planet totally unlivable. And let's just say that we find that there are certain traits that some people have, or certain genes that make it more possible for us to live in, like Tibetans have certain genes that make it more possible for them to live at altitude. I think that these technologies, a certain set of us are going to use in order to make it so we can survive in this planet as it changes. And we all know that this planet is like a ticking time bomb. We're going to be out of here in a blink of a couple billion years. And hopefully we'll be around then. But I would imagine that at some point when we start colonizing other places in the solar system, it's not like we're going to be shooting yellow buses full of people. We're going to be shooting a 3D printer, a robot, and some embryos to go and colonize some other place. So I think who knows what's happening with this with this planet. But I think it's not going to be that technology is not going to matter. I think technology is going to be something that we're going to need to use to survive in a more hostile environment. But trust your professor. All right, how are we doing time-wise?
We're good.
Oh, good.
Plenty
Okay.
of room.
Oh, good. All right, let's let it rip. Yes.
Further.
Hi. I just want to preface by saying that everything you said makes me incredibly uncomfortable.
Okay, good.
But since you said that you're not a scientist, I want to ask you a non-scientific
Great.
question more about your philosophy.
Yes.
What do you think makes for a good life? What do you think is the
Yeah.
purpose of humanity?
Yeah, that's the essential question. And I was saying that's why I made my novel a love story. Because at the end of the day, what matters is communities and happiness and love and caring and all of these things that don't require Homo sapien 2.0. We have a hard enough time as 1.0. And yet, we live in this intensely competitive environment, both within societies and between societies. And I think that if it was possible, and there are many people who say, well, I'm just going to opt out of this competitive life and I'm going to go and live in an ashram or whatever. But for many of us, we live in this competitive world where we're competing against other people, where our countries are competing against other countries. And if you opt in, there are all of these competitive pressures. And I just think that because of the nature, the competitive nature of our species. And this the combination of competition and hubris has really pushed us forward very actively. For those people who kind of stay in the arena, there'll be a question. And if it's in terms of national competitiveness, do we care if we live in a society that can compete with some other society? Maybe we should say, well, we don't care. And that even if they're doing something that changes their genetics and it makes it so that we're not going to be able to compete, we can live with that. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate choice. Or if I'm going to have a child and I know that my child isn't going to have much of a chance at getting the kind of best jobs or the most career opportunities, but I think it's worth it because I have a philosophy about what it means to be natural and what it means to be happy. I think that'll be a perfectly legitimate choice, and many people will make it. But I think that the pressures of competition will be so great that other people won't. And there'll be consequences of both of those decisions. But for me personally, like, will it make everybody happier if we all have 20-point higher IQs? No. Will it make us less happy if everybody else has a 20 points higher IQ than us? It could. And so that's this bind, is that it's not like people ask, well, are you for technology or are you against technology? And I think it's like, are you for the sun rising or against the sun? I think the technology is here. And so that's why I think that there's, I don't have a fulfilling answer to your question, but that's exactly the right question. And it will lead people in to different conclusions. But what's your thought?
I think that we should, instead of working on this technology, we should be working on deconstructing competition and deconstructing nation states and deconstructing a world where we are forced to make these immoral choices.
Yeah. No, I think that would be great. I don't want to be the first one. I think that's the problem, is that I think most people would agree, like, if we could just kind of get rid of the nation state and get rid of all these crazy constructs and get rid of all this competitiveness and everybody was kind of happy and got along, that would be a great world, and I definitely want to live in that world. But unfortunately...
But why is my utopia more crazy than your utopia?
It's not. Yours is. I love your utopia. I want to live there. But but philosophically, I guess, I'm more of a Hobbesian.
Right.
Like, I think that left to their own devices without a structure, people will gouge each other's eyes out and slaughter each other in about 10 minutes. And so unfortunately, I believe, and this is separate from this talk, unfortunately the nation state, which is this very flawed construct, like right now, the thing that's more dangerous than the nation state is the non-nation state. And you look at what's happening in Europe. I mean, Europe is this wonderful utopia because after the Second World War, the United States took security off the table. We basically provided all the security for Europe, and the Europeans have, for a generation or more, have come to believe that hard power doesn't matter, and it's all about norm building and share alike and all those kinds of things. But it turns out that when there's one bad actor, in this case Russia, all of a sudden all of the people who are more utopian and everything we would all like to be have no defense. And so unfortunately, and this is just a philosophical view, and in my philosophical view, I just think that people need to protect themselves in a competitive environment. But I would love to live in your world. I think people can, and people do it in small places. And I think that societies may very well, and maybe even should, make a decision that we don't want to go there. It's just there'll be consequences of making that decision. We should at least be mindful of those. Yes? Yeah.
For people who don't understand what competition is, I just want to say something. Without competition, many of your comforts in life were not going to be possible.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's she talks about utopia. What you're talking about more so, I feel, is more like you're just trying to say what direction we're already going in at this point. Because it's like you said, if America chooses not to look into stem cell research, to genetic research, other countries will do it. That's the greatness of having many nations.
Yeah.
One nation can choose to do one thing, and other nations will choose to do another thing. That's what we call freedom.
Yeah, and I think and the answer is that both of you are right. And if we had a world that was entirely defined by your view or your view, in my view, it would be really dangerous. If we had a world where just like it's all about unfettered competition without without values then I think that would be, I know that's not what you're saying, but that would be a dangerous world. And if we had a world that was just share and share alike, tear down the walls, I think that would be a dangerous world. But I think that we need both of those. I know I'm turning you guys into straw men, but we need both of those together to have a smart conversation. Yeah.
What I'm saying is because there's so many different countries, maybe one country will maybe try to work towards that ideal she speak of, and then another country will speak towards maybe a different kind of ideal.
Yeah.
I think many countries, there's more choice, there's more options, there's more variety, and that's diversity is what makes things better, in my opinion.
Yeah, it does, but the problem is there's also the danger and the potential for the equivalent of an arms race. So going back to my thing, like if country X is genetically engineering its population, and then they are going to have this kind of Plato's Republic, then there's the danger that everybody else won't be competitive. And so I think,
I feel like that's, and you know what, the other countries will eventually have to catch up. That's like the nuclear arms race. We all thought
exactly.
The entire world is going to be blown into a nuclear smithereen.
Right.
That has not happened.
Yeah.
Ever since Japan, it's never happened again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Jenny, sorry, and you're next. Sorry. Yeah.
if you could pose one question to presidential candidates for 2016 on this topic, what would that question be?
Oh, God, that's a great one. I usually just spout out the answers right away, but I'm going to do something unprecedented. I'm going to take a moment to think. And I'm going to send you an email with a better answer.
Okay.
But I think, and it's hard because no presidential candidate could answer any of these questions because they'd be ripped to smithereens in a moment.
No, worse, they're completely ignorant.
Yeah.
They're completely ignorant.
Yeah.
And that is truly at the heart of the matter.
Well, I agree, but even if you're not, even our presidential candidates who are actually really knowledgeable have to pretend that they're completely ignorant. Like when John Kerry was running for president, he had to pretend that he didn't speak French, even though he does speak French. And I think the one I would say is and this is going to be a bad one, I'm going to be on the plane home tonight, and I'm going to think, I should have said something better. But I think just something broad, like what is your view about the general application of embryo selection? But it's a terrible question. I'm going to think of something better. But luckily,
the answer will probably be equal.
Because you're not allowed to answer those questions because you would alienate everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's the problem, is that we have so many constraints on what we can and can't talk about. But that's why I feel like now is the time we can have the most thoughtful conversation on this topic, even though it's very difficult, because once the first genetically modified people start showing up, everyone's going to freak out. It's the equivalent of Ebola. For 20 years, we've known that Ebola is out there, and many people decades ago read the book Hot Zone. And then for 20 years, it was this thing, it's kind of this bad thing, it happens in Africa, but it's not really our problem. And then it blows up in Africa, and then it's another one of those stories, those poor people in Africa. And then 3 people with Ebola show up in the United States, and all of a sudden, everybody here freaks out, and we can't have a thoughtful, smart conversation about Ebola. And I think that's what's going to happen, is we're not going to talk about it. And then some genetically modified person's going to show up, and then everyone's going to freak out, and everyone's going to get behind the barricade. So that's why I'm really hoping that we can have a more thoughtful conversation now.
So my question will be...
You were next, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Which college will be the first to put a line on the application, are you a genetically modified?
I think it's a real question. And in sports, it will show up very quickly. I mean, I've been following a lot this Lance Armstrong debate. I'm totally on the side of Lance Armstrong. I think he's a total victim of this, because there's this sport, and this is what the report that came out this week showed. There was this sport, international cycling. It was a known cheater's sport. Every single person who was in that sport at the time when Lance Armstrong competed was doing drugs. If you didn't do drugs, you had absolutely no chance of winning. The leaders of the sport knew it. Everybody knew it. And Lance Armstrong is a jerk, but he was also doing it. And then they decided to change the culture, and they needed to go back and find a victim to do it. And so, we already are comfortable with all kinds of modifications through drugs. We're already very comfortable with plastic surgery. There are all these kinds of modifications that we're comfortable with. And I just think that we will think of humans and modified humans. And I think that over time, maybe we'll divide, like we have in weightlifting. There's the steroid weightlifting and non-steroid weightlifting. The state the steroid people all look like the Incredible Hulk, and the non-steroid people look like Mahatma Gandhi. But eventually, I think enhancement will be part of what it means to be human. And I don't know whether that's 100 years or 200 years, but all right, I promise you are next.
Well, just to back up a minute.
Yeah.
I think that one of the problems in the thinking process is that the idea is that some trait, whether it's intelligence or any other trait, is going to make you happy. Or even wealth, or you know, whatever you want to call it, being taller or being shorter, or being skinnier, or any number of things that people aspire to. But you know, there is no correlation actually between intellect and happiness. It's almost like two separate railroad tracks. And in my experience, doing psychological counseling here at the university, I could say to you that many very highly intelligent people are very unhappy. So it's not about the IQ, it's not about the intellect, it's something else. So I think I urge you to think about what goes into being more fulfilled in life. And it's something different than these separate qualities, you know, whether you're skinny or fatter, or whether your hair is curly or short, or you know, all these things that we all want. You know, you always want what you don't have. You know what I mean? All that. That's not where you're gonna find it. And even if you buy a pretty purse and stuff, you know, that's not the answer. We all know that. Those things just don't. They might perk you up, but they don't really. They don't do it. So it's something more profound and deeper, and something we look for inside ourselves rather than by trying to attach things to ourselves in order to enhance ourselves.
You must be a Jewish Buddhist. So I agree with everything you said, but I don't know if people saw the story in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday. And it was basically, and whether this is true or not, but they've identified what they call a happiness gene. And 20% of the population has this genetic predisposition to happiness.
Or to being less
to be content.
vulnerable.
Yeah, or to be a contentedness.
To being less vulnerable.
And so it's just, like, I agree with everything that you said, but it comes back to what I was saying about how complex are we as a species. And there's a lot of things that we feel are essential to who we are that also exist on the genetic level, but happiness and attitude, and there's a wonderful book which, if you haven't read it, I know that it will be one of your favorite books. It's called Generosity by Richard Powers, but it's all about, there's this one woman in a college, and she's like a survivor of this horrible refugee situation, and she's like just ecstatically happy, and they sequence her, and they find that she's got this magical genetic formula for happiness. And it's about everything that goes, but it happens in a college, and one of the main characters is the college counselor. And anyway, Generosity by Richard Powers, highly recommended. Yes?
I don't know if this has an obvious answer or not, but if you were to have children and you had the choice to genetically modify your children, I mean, would that just be a no-brainer for you?
You know, it's so funny, that exact question, almost word for word, I was in Los Angeles as part of my book tour. And it's kind of easy, like you go and you talk about technology and the future, and it's kind of impersonal. Somebody asked me that exact question, and it kind of like stopped me in my tracks. And so then I blogged about the exact answer to that question. And what I said is I kind of went through the decision tree, like I went through in the beginning of my talk, of like, well, would I want to screen, all things being equal, and if it was safe, would I want to screen out genetic diseases? I mean, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew in my 40s, so when I have kids, there are certain risk factors that are just there, and would I want to screen out certain genetic diseases? And I would think, well, probably. And then if somebody said, well, you can, of these, and so you're already doing IVF if you want to do this screening, and someone said, well, you can know these genetic qualities or predispositions of your potential children. Do you want to know? Well, I have a philosophy in life, like I'm a big data person. If I could have like a blood test every day, I would do it. There's no, whenever anyone asks me the question, well, you may not want to know this, I always say whatever the thing is, I want to know. I'd rather, and so I definitely would want to know. And so then, all right, now I have all of this data. I know of whatever these 10 embryos, which are the ones that are likely to carry certain genetic diseases, which are the ones that are likely to be the most contented, which are the ones to have the highest IQ. And then I say, well, all of these 10 are my natural children. Would I want to rank order each of those embryos? And I have to say, I mean, it makes me a bit of a freak, but I probably would. If the next step was, do I want to like genetically engineer them and give them like eagle sight and all these kinds, then I would be more cautious.
So I think it's time to thank Jamie.